Hello and welcome to the Raisina Idea Sport 2025. We are here today to discuss the topic financing climate resilience. And joining me, I have two very distinguished experts. Pepukaye Bardouille, who's the director of the Bridgetown Initiative and a special advisor on climate resilience to the Prime Minister's Office, Barbados. And we have Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh, Vice President, Development Studies with ORF India. So welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Climate resilience is a very important subject. I mean, we all know that, but more so today because geopolitically we're at a time when it is under fire, right? The whole climate agenda is under fire. And unlike mitigation, which still attracts the majority of the funding, almost more than 80%, adaptation and climate resilience is sort of a relatively much neglected subject within the climate landscape. Despite being one that is more people-centric. Unlike mitigation, adaptation is more socio-economic and cultural in its sort of ambit, in a way that it impacts people way more, it's way closer to people's lives, it impacts people's lives way more closely. Yet it is something which is not often mainstreamed in policy discussions, in government practices, in decision-making, whether by investors or governments alike. So I'm going to dive right into this, and I want to start with you, Pep. Barbados recently launched one of its kind, and one of the first in the world, actually, the debt for climate swap. So I would love for you to maybe talk about that and, run our readers through what were the challenges in maybe achieving something which is absolutely phenomenal and absolutely one of a kind. And what were the challenges, but also how can other island countries which don't have the kind of weight that Barbados does also apply something similar and adopt a very similar mechanism and scale it up and adopt it to their advantage on financing and adaptation?
Thank you. It's an excellent question, and you're right. Just a few months ago, we closed on our debt for climate swap. We'd previously done a debt for nature swap, and for context, we're in the process of doing a debt for social swap, as well as championing a regional debt swap, which I think is also quite unique. Why do we do a debt for climate swap? Well, firstly, we have expensive debt, like many other countries around the world. We swapped $300 million US dollars in debt and saved $130 million over 10 years. Which is a tremendous saving for a small country. Yeah. But even if you just look at the 130 million over 300 million, it's a no-brainer. Now, those resources have required a little bit of engineering to front load them into the 130 million. Otherwise, it's a cash flow, right, that you save over time. And we're using those resources to fund one of our critical investments from our investment plan in prosperity and resilience. In this particular case, it's a sanitation project, sewage treatment plant with an add-on for agricultural water. Critical, again, for a small island that's very, very water-starved, water-scarce. Now, what does it take to do these swaps? It takes a few things. The first one is a pipeline of projects. So you need, and no pun intended, but you need that project there. The second, as you've already alluded to, is trust. You need partners, financial partners, development partners who actually trust that this country is going to get it right. And you are correct that Barbados does have a little bit of a privileged position because of the weight of the Prime Minister. And this cannot be the basis on which all countries do swaps. But the third is really skills within the team. We have two debt advisors who are full-time, and we had another colleague who was full-time with the project implementation unit, together with other colleagues from the Ministry of Finance. It's hugely resource-intensive. And why is it resource-intensive? Because in this particular instance, we're working with the Green Climate Fund that provided some low-cost concessional financing, and with the European Investment Bank, the EIB, and the Inter-American Development Bank. And the EIB and the IDB provided the guarantees that were needed for the market to feel comfortable with the swap. The great news is that this leveraged private capital, so it was private placement, with the majority of the capital coming from the domestic capital markets, right? So domestic banks, local banks, which is, again, tremendous in the context of adaptation, because we always look outside. Where do we get the resources from ODA? Where do we get it from external debt? How do we attract foreign direct investment? These are all part of the toolkit. They have to be part of the solution, but we also need to leverage domestic markets. Absolutely. So this is wonderful, but the struggle has been in getting two different financial institutions, committed as they are, well placed as Barbados is, to cooperate and guarantee. So what does it take to scale up? Certainly it needs technical assistance. We need a huge amount of resources in each of our governments, and you need that project pipeline. So with these more ambitious NDCs that we're seeing, that's wonderful, but it cannot just be around mitigation. Where are the projects for adaptation? And we had an investment plan right and ready to go. So we need countries to have those investment plans that are not just on paper, but they're real and they can be executed on. And the third is guarantees. And this is one of the areas that we're pushing within the Bridgetown Initiative, which is a scaling up of guarantee structures and ideally not using the multilateral development banks. Because in most cases, you have an IDA or an IBRD envelope, an allocation. If you do a swap and they're guaranteeing it, it eats into your allocation. So what we need to do is bring new resources to the table from bilaterals. And I think the argument for bilaterals, so, we have a number of bilaterals who are interested in the topic, is that you can leverage these resources. This is contingent. This is a guarantee. This is not cash out of the door. If you trust the projects and you trust the country and you believe in domestic resource mobilization, for me, this makes absolute sense as an investment opportunity, that guarantee pooled guarantees for countries to scale up. And we need to stop treating countries as individuals and maybe look at them collectively. We all have the same issues. So many water-scarce countries, so many countries with coastal erosion, with soil degradation, with low-cost housing that needs to be improved. These are all part of the adaptation pool of projects that need to be funded.
Wow, that's an excellent answer. And you've unpacked so much in that so little time. So thank you for that. But I think what I take from your intervention is pipeline of projects, good policy signaling by governments so that we build and initiate trust, excellent partnerships, whether it's bilateral or multilateral, and of course skills, investing in people, investing in education. And I think that pulls into the whole people-centric element of adaptation and resilience, which is extremely crucial, and naturally the blended finance mechanism, which you've managed to achieve. Which actually brings me to you, Dr. Ghosh. You're quite the finance expert. And can you run us through what are the different institutional and governance and financial mechanisms that currently exist that could help us advance and accelerate climate resilience, funneling of capital from the north to the south? And at the same time, do we need alternative mechanisms and institutions perhaps to maybe supplant and support the current ones, or should we completely have something independent of the current ones? So what is your thought on that?
So let me come to the very fundamental issue that you raised, and it was also raised during your intervention, that if we really look at the climate financing portfolio in totality, we find that there is a clear bias in favor of mitigation projects. And against adaptation projects. Now, though you categorically mentioned that adaptation projects are much more people-centric, despite that, what happens is that we don't find a market, or investors really don't find a market. You can't create a project out of adaptation mechanisms. What happens is that in the case of mitigation projects, there's a clear, perceptible ROI, a return on investment. That is an economic rate of return. Whereas in most cases, for adaptation projects, you find that it is in some way or the other associated with the creation of some form of a public good, which doesn't have a perceptible private economic rate of return. But what happened, and that is precisely why in most cases investors find that, okay, fine, this might not be remunerative. You can't see a break-even point. You can't see, don't know when you are going to get back the money. So now this has somehow plagued the flow of funds for adaptation, including, in fact, it is not merely private investors. MDBs are also involved in this scheme. So even if you look at their portfolios, it is almost the same. But the fact remains that if you really get out of this economic rate of return or say ROI kind of return on investment kind of a mechanism and try to look at what we call the social rate of return from adaptation projects, and you will find that it's huge in the sense that there were some estimates made by the Global Commission on Adaptation in 2019, which states that if you put in $1 for adaptation, you're going to have $4 return in 10 years, in a decade. Actually, this is merely a conservative estimate. I would say that it's possibly $10. Think about something like a nature-based solution, which results in some form of, say, I want to regenerate mangroves, right, in the coastal region. So, in one sense, what happens? Okay, fine, this turns out to be a mitigation project, precisely because you're getting into a carbon sequestration mechanism. On the other side, think about the adaptation mechanism that is created in the process, the resilience that is created in the process. It is helping you in the context of storm surge protection, because already a buffer has been created between, suppose, say, the ocean, the blue, and the coastal ecosystem, and also the agroeconomy associated with it. To a certain extent, it also helps, in fact, certain ecosystem services, including the provisioning services of the ecosystem, like, suppose, the fisheries, like, say, suppose, certain crustacean species, many other things, which we are not valuing.
Yeah.
Now, the question is that how do we look at markets? Do we really look at markets only from the framework of carbon? Or we should expand the framework of the market to all these services which the enhanced ecosystem in the form of NBS is providing us with.
Yeah.
But our very mindset is very reductionist in nature, that we are only looking at carbon. Carbon is going to be the thing.
Yeah.
So that is one element. Now, if we talk about how do we bring about a change, present institutional mechanisms are not going to bring about this change. It is very, very difficult, practically impossible to infuse this feeling, in fact, maybe in the present DFIs, or even you talk about, say, bilateral institutions or whosoever, to bring about this change. Can we think about an alternate institution? Well, very recently we came up with this paper from the Observer Research Foundation. I was the lead author, and we conceptualized this framework of North-South transfer through a G20 DFI, a G20 Development Financial Institution. The G20 is meant for that.
Yeah.
Infuse financial, in some way or the other, infuse finance into the system. So where you have the global North present as also the global South present, why can't we have something like the G20 DFI? Secondly, how do we also create a market for adaptation and possibly bring about private finance into the system? One way is that how do you look at this rate of return? Now, if I create, say, let's think in these terms. The global private wealth in 2023 stands at, as per UBS estimate, stands at $454 trillion US. This is slated to rise to $627 trillion US by 2027. Can't I mobilize 1% of that every year? Either through creating some kind of a major project which yields a rate of return, or something that is more contentious, at the cost of being provocative, propose a wealth tax.
Yeah.
For meeting this need, something for which already, in fact, you have a problem, you have a financing problem. And add $4.5 trillion US, think about the size. This covers the entire SDG financing gap.
Yeah, it's massive.
Out of which you apportion that for climate financing or climate action.
Yeah.
So there are alternate mechanisms, but we just have to think innovatively. Certain things are doable, certain might not be doable. And this is a fabulous, just think of this, this green credit swaps.
Yeah.
A fabulous mechanism. But what is more fundamental is that we are, the kind of valuation mechanism that we created was only tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
So if I would have valued that entire ecosystem and the service that it provides, then possibly that would have been higher than the GDP of Galapagos Island or even Barbados.
Yeah. No, absolutely. But that brings me to your point that we're having to do so much financial maneuvering for this. It's an absolute struggle. And I think the case with Barbados is one-off. They are one of, because they've been sort of pioneering this effort for so long. But what about the other countries? And I think you do make a very interesting point around the finance element. But my question is, we live in such a capitalistic model where financial institutions absolutely fail to incorporate climate risks, historical responsibility when it comes to carbon emissions. How can we ever get to that system? I think we've spoken so much about it. This is a very theoretical subject on paper. Sounds great. But when it comes to practicality of it, from a very government and a think tank perspective, can we ever get to a point where banks and asset owners will start investing and incorporate climate risks into their decision-making analysis? Is there a future for that?
I'm going to jump in on that question.
Please.
Hard as it is,
Yes.
I'd love to hear your feedback, but I also just wonder if I may just add to a couple of your excellent points. Right? You talked about mangroves, etc. And also clarify, Barbados is not a one-off. Let's call it a first-off.
Absolutely.
Let's call it a first-off, because I also think this mindset shift is critical. And that mindset shift speaks to your point around, I think, demystifying adaptation. There's absolutely cases in which there's an economic and maybe not obvious financial rate of return. But let me give you some examples. And you spoke a little bit to this in the context of mangroves and fisheries. So if you look at coral reef protection, so ecosystem services, these are well known. If you look at a country like Barbados, 45 to 50% of the GDP is directly or indirectly connected to the tourism sector. And why do tourists come to Barbados? Of course, for the culture, and there's different tourism over the years. Sometimes it's meetings and incentives, other times it's our crop over season. Yeah. But for the most part, it's tourists who want to come to the country during the cold months of the Western Hemisphere, global north, looking for beaches. Beach erosion, there's a direct link between beaches existing and not existing and tourists coming or not coming. When 45 to 50% of your GDP is dependent, that is a question of survival for a small country. And so coral reefs, we know, will protect if we can get to a point where we're regrowing that or even doing grey infrastructure, defenses. Let's look at water. So water loss. Barbados loses between 40 and 60% of its water because our mains were laid decades, in some cases over a century ago. We're not even clear where they are and where the leaks are, but the effort of finding them is extremely costly. Who wants to take the risk of digging up pipes? But losing that water means you have to replace it with desalinated water. And desalinated water is extremely expensive, especially if you then put it in the pipes and go and lose it again. So you can run the numbers. Similarly, housing, most people are private owners. Of course, there's people at the base of the pyramid, lower ends of the economic spectrum, who are in subsidized housing or free housing. But in Dominica, where I come from, right, after Hurricane Maria, which was a Category 5 storm, where we lost $1.2 billion or 260% of our GDP overnight in 24 hours, the insurance premium went up 86% overnight. So you have to ask yourself the question, if I had access to a low-cost loan to make my roof more resilient to storms, right, and to make my home in general more resilient to flooding, fix my drains, things like this, that's 86% of your insurance premium. If we can then get the insurance industry, which owns, by the way, $40 trillion in assets, $40 trillion in assets we're not leveraging for risk. Information sufficiently risk data, and we're looking at that as a Bridgetown initiative. We're not leveraging those assets to enhance resilience where they own infrastructure. So I think there's a lot that can be done. But to go back to your question, what does it fundamentally come down to? It comes down to us as individuals. If we are not investing as retail investors, not to mention institutional investors, your pension funds are not going into ESG, sovereign wealth funds are not going into ESG investment, then you can't expect the market to do it for you. It starts with political pressure, and that political pressure ultimately comes from the ground up. Who votes in politicians? Who demands what of the companies that they're putting their money in? And so you're absolutely right. It is a huge shift, but our entire planet depends on it. And I would argue that our personal and moral, individual well-being, ultimately how much, when you, and you know this Native American proverb, once you have, finished all the water and consumed all the land, like what are you going to live on? What is it that fundamentally drives us and makes us happy? What are you going to eat? What are you going to breathe? So I do think that we have a short-termism, which is not improved by our digital lives, right? By an increasingly individualistic life. But this is where we have to go back, I think, to the more traditional aspects, the more community-driven. And community is almost like, how do we involve communities? No, how do you go back to community? So again, these are a little bit idealistic, but I do think that they are fundamental. And until and unless we change the system internally as individuals, the external system is not going to have any direction.
Yeah. So I think I take from that adaptation is as economic as it is a social, cultural imperative.
So
and
let me just respond to that, because this is something very crucial. And it clearly creates a case for valuation of this opportunity cost.
Yeah, and that's where the banks fit into that.
Exactly. Of course. And what we have been missing out so far is that the market essentially is myopic. Let's face it. Market cannot see what is beyond the short run.
Yeah. Quarterly report.
Of course. So are we really looking at the storm protection function or the storm surge protection function? No. Till the time I put across a value to it. Are we really looking at the losses to the agro ecosystem, not merely agriculture, the agro ecosystem as a whole? Till the time I put a value to it. So this entire valuation mechanism is missing from the entire discourse so far. So till the time I get into this valuation of the ecosystem services, the valuation of the opportunity cost when I'm cutting down the mangrove forests, I'm simply not getting into a market framework. Don't even dream of a market framework. Now, the other element which we possibly need to bring in here for adaptation is the role of philanthropy. And CSR, of course, but philanthropy becomes very crucial in here. And possibly because it has to work through grants, and philanthropists are in a position, but they don't often understand that they're putting money into climate. But it is often not understood whether that is getting into adaptation or mitigation.
Yeah. And majority is mitigation.
Majority is mitigation, right? Because there's a project around it.
Yeah.
So that creates a bit of a problem in here. So the fundamental issue is, again, let me harp upon that till the time we get into valuation, and again, let me get in one more point. We think of why markets are myopic. If you talk about the social cost of carbon today, for India, it stands at to the tune of $84 per ton. But think about the price, the VER market. It's barely not $10 to $12 per ton.
Yeah.
So look at this divergence.
It's massive. I'm pressed for time, but I'm going to be a little selfish here because I'll be remiss if I didn't ask this last question, but you have literally 30 seconds to answer that, so consider that as your closing remarks. We have the L&D fund, the operationalization if it is a big challenge. 30 seconds, what can we do to make it really impactful and to really get the money flowing?
Look, I think you started to speak to this, right, which is solidarity levies. I think there's no way around that. Again, to remind you, $1.2 billion for a country of 65,000 people. The fund stands at, what, 700 and change million today? Right? We're not talking about floods in large countries, and we're talking about a small island. I think ultimately this goes back to solidarity. And are we willing, for example, to make a success out of the IMO process right now, which is looking at the emissions from the shipping sector? And are we willing and able to really push through, including through the G20, other sectors which are highly emitting? And when is the right time to do that? You spoke about wealth tax. Is this the right time, or do we want to be strategic about when we bring things in so that they don't get knocked out? But for sure, shipping needs to be made a success. And it cannot just go to fund changes within the sector. It has also got to support loss and damage.
So let me put across 4 key factors, 4 problems that we are facing right now with L&D. That's a challenge. A, the problem of definition. What is permanent loss and permanent damage? B, the problem of attribution. Sea level rise, maybe in fact in large parts of the Bay of Bengal, is eating up on the land. But is it only sea level rise in the Ganges Delta? Or is it the construction of the Farakka barrage, which is not allowing the sediment to flow to resuscitate the soil loss? So attribution science. C, valuation. What is the value of this loss and damage on the basis of which the compensation is going to happen? And if we are talking about permanent loss or permanent damage, then we cannot think about the 1-year loss. We have to think about, say, a 20-year present value, because it's an opportunity loss for the next 20 years for the community, till the time we create an alternate system. And 4, financing.
We've discussed that.
We've solved that.
So yes. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to end on an optimistic note that, you know, if you have experts like yourselves in the room who are so passionate about the cause, we'll certainly get to the solution. And so thank you for all the work that you do, most importantly.
Thank you.